thank you. And we'll just jump right into our next session. For those who are here by Zoom, welcome back. To those in the room, also welcome back. And I'd just like to introduce Rina Krystal Warren, who is from the Fitikaupeka, I hope I said that right, Iwi and the North Island, and Lana Lopesi, our two speakers, who is Samoan living here in Auckland, New Zealand. And again, we're not doing a lot of extensive introductions because we cannot do justice to our speakers. So we'll just let them jump right into their sharing. And I think Rina is going to start for us. And Sanjana, if we're good. Okay. Yeah, so Rina.
Oh, kia ora. Can you hear me, firstly?
Rina, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Ka pai. O tēnā tātou katoa, tēnei te mihi atu ki a tātou, kua hui nei I tēnei rā. Hoi anō he mihi hoki tēnei ki te whenua, ki te wai paunamu, ki tērā kāinga o tātou e hui nei ki rungi te ipurangi a tēnā tātou katoa. Nei rā te mihi ki te iwi, ki te hau kāinga o Ngaitahu, e karaputi nei I a tātou nō reira tēnā tātou katoa. So just want to acknowledge all of the Indigenous lands that all of us reside on and are meeting together in this virtual space, but still to acknowledge the Indigenous lands of every person who is joining in via the airwaves. So I'm joining you from Palmerston North, so from Rangitani lands, but myself I am of Ngāti Whātikaupeka from Taihape. So all of you who have maybe made a journey in the North Island on State Highway 1, you will have passed through my hometown gumboot land. So there you go. Now you know where I come from. So I suppose are we just jumping straight into it, Jeremy? Is that how we're doing this? Okay. So my interest in the area of social media came about from two particular things. Firstly, having a teenage daughter who was brought up in surrounded by her Māori culture, so brought up predominantly in a big family, frequenting the marae, going to kura kaupapa Māori, so having her first language as te reo Māori, and then seeing her come into the teenage years, and weirdly enough starting to exhibit some pretty foreign and unusual behaviour from my perspective, which was from a Māori cultural perspective, and this gave rise to my beginning or around critical analysis of what was happening in the space, especially for our young people, and especially based on cultural perspectives that are represented in these different spaces. And then I think, I cannot remember the year that it was, maybe around 2010, 2011, I happened to be at an airport in Oahu in Hawaii. Those distant memories that shall be distant for some time now, given our current circumstances. But I was talking to one of our Pakeke, one of our elders, Roger Marker, who is also well known in terms of Indigenous development field. And we started talking about a recent funeral or tangihanga that had occurred amongst our people, somebody of great standing, and we were talking about how it had been broadcast to London, where many of his former colleagues were participating in the tangihanga process. So again, from a Māori cultural perspective, the tangihanga process is a very deep and sacred ritual and filled with ceremony. And so we started talking about how in today's reality with technology, one could theoretically participate in all the necessary processes and steps of a very sacred ritual, which is tangihanga, but never have to lay their feet on the actual marae, on our ancestral home. And this gave rise for some further concern for me, because Ranginui Walker, another acclaimed Indigenous and Māori academic, had also identified that marae were the bastions of our culture. So through the whole urbanisation and colonisation, strong colonisation period, the active participation of Māori at their marae was a main building block or mainstay, I suppose, for preserving and conserving our culture. It was one of the only places that Māori could go for a long period of time to speak and hear their own language, to practice our own ways of being. And so those two ideas, right, this whole new internet reality alongside marae as a bastion of our culture, they posed a little bit of an opposing force, I suppose, in my mind. And so I started to investigate what the role of the internet was in contemporary lifestyles, but also how contemporary lifestyles are being influenced by the internet. And this was kind of, I had this idea kind of before the rise of Facebook, before Facebook took over. And so that's kind of what I started thinking about. What happens in those spaces, in the interface between culture and the internet or social media. So I feel very much like Lana that this space is in Lana's words, a double-edged sword. Very much has so much to offer. And I think previously we heard about small social groups being able to find each other online, that type of thing, and the transmission of knowledges perhaps, or education through online spaces. However, I become concerned about the behaviour of my child that started to demonstrate to me a quick assimilation into whatever the culture of the spaces that she was engaging in expected of her, I suppose. So this kind of idea that even though I thought that my child had a very strong cultural identity as a Māori first language Māori speaker, her desire to engage in the space meant that there wasn't much critical, I mean, what can you expect of a 12-year-old really, but there wasn't a huge critical analysis about the ways in which the behaviour she was behaving in these spaces. And so I did what any normal parent would do. No, probably not what any normal parent would do, but I kind of set out, you know, other whānau members, other family members to be kind of my eyes in these other spaces. But that whole idea then gave rise to the topic of my current PhD study, which is looking at how the internet and digital spaces impact on Māori culture. Because I think quite often all of the work that I've seen so far looks at how the culture can be translated into this digital space, but not necessarily what are the repercussions or what are the adverse effects of the digital space onto culture. And so if I look back into Māori history, for example, the advent of the nail, we don't look at that as a technology anymore, but the introduction of the nail had a huge impact on Māori living, from building to carving, and so on, as did the rise of the pen, for example, as a new technology within Māori cultural history, which then kind of had a move away from some more customary or traditional ways of doing things. And I think in addition to the move away from culture, there is the potential for things to be lost. And I think that's kind of what we need to be very aware of. So for example, in our history, the uptake of European clothing, for example, meant that traditional and customary ways of growing, harvesting, and manufacturing, in essence, our own sources of clothing, led to the space where by maybe the 1980s, there was only a handful of people who still knew how to make Māori customary garments. And so it seems like a very, almost kind of like a Stone Age kind of a concept now when you look at it, but actually this is a very real thing that happened in our history. And so not only the knowledge around weaving and around making customary garments was about to be lost, but also the entire bodies of knowledge that accompany, for example, the making of a cloak, of a korowai. So the entire planting and harvesting and growing process, and then the skill set. So what I started to see was an uptake of new technology. There is the potential to lose something, and I become kind of interested in, okay, how is it that we create some type of framework by which we might be always cognizant of our gains, but also be able to ensure that we're not losing anything in that process. And I think Lana maybe might talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Rina. I think that's a great transition point for Lana to maybe pick up some really key ideas of, and the historical, the long-term history, the intergenerational history. I think that Indigenous communities, Māori communities bring to this discussion is really important. Lana, you of course have a very different perspective, and we'd just love to hear that.
Patalofasu, I'm Lana. Thank you for having me. Excuse me for reading off my phone. So I'm going to talk about Pacific representations, but in particular, I'm interested in Pacific Twitter use, or poly-Twitter colloquially. And I focus on Twitter because, like Sanjana mentioned at the start of the day, that the conversation is significantly different in comparison to both mainstream media and also the way in which Pacific people use Facebook. And so just to iterate quickly, I'm speaking from a New Zealand diasporic perspective. And so there is a particular relationship to colonization, which is very different to that of Māori in New Zealand. And to speak from a Samoan diasporic perspective particularly is also to acknowledge that Samoa as a nation has gone through formal decolonization. It's now independent and has been for some decades. And so there is a different sense or non-sense of cultural loss of language and protocol and practices. And so I think those distinctions around the colonial relationship are really important in terms of not flattening the differences between Te Rina and myself. And I also don't want to flatten the differences between Pacific social media representation within diasporic communities in industrialized nations versus those on the Pacific Islands with very real and very different issues of personal and national access to hard and software, connectivity, issues around freedom of speech, censorship, etc. Also, I just always have to say this disclaimer, I'm not a Pacific social media expert because I don't know if such a thing exists in a region which is so large that it spans 2,000 language groups, a region so large it covers a third of the world's surface. And so as the sole representative to have to talk about Pacific social media today, I just have to have said that. So one of the things Rina and I discussed previously with Jeremy and Sanjana was the idea that the internet is a new frontier for colonization. And so social media from my perspective is just an extension of this world, which is colonial, white, patriarchal, heterosexual, ableist, ageist, and in which the norm is not people like me and it's not of a worldview like mine. And so that's something that I think Indigenous people are not strangers to. And so some of these structural conversations are kind of very familiar, again, to borrow from Sanjana, because they just are the way in which we live in the world, let alone on social media. And so I have written about social media for Pacific people as a double-edged sword. Given the internet's acceleration of both globalization and market capital under global neoliberalism, Pacific people sit in an uneasy space on the internet. On this uneasiness, the hegemonic assumptions of the global good of new media technologies have to be accepted by Indigenous people in order to progress or have their voices heard. This is the double bind of representation which has to fight against but also operate within the four walls of existing media practices. Indigenous internet users must understand and to some extent conform to the architecture and all of its limitations and restrictions of the space, its systems and its structures. What do we gain though, I think, and I'm not going to labor over these points, but connectivity, which for a really dispersed group where we have larger communities of Pacific people in places like Auckland or California, the way in which the online space reconnects and creates kinds of undercommons or counterpublics, I think cannot be underestimated. These conversations are able to happen because of this connectivity, and they haven't happened in this scale and in this global way before. These are things like lighthearted representations of culture, but they're also things like inter-community conversations tackling homophobia and transphobia within the Pacific community, anti-Blackness, etc. And alongside this is platforming, again, very straightforward, but in a country like New Zealand, Pacific representation on mainstream media is very small, and up until a few years ago, I would have said almost non-existent. Given the dearth of Pacific perspectives in general within social media platforms, specifically Twitter, Pacific perspectives on issues of national significance are equal for perhaps the first time. And additionally, not one Pacific people perspective, apologies, is upheld, but actually we're able to see that Pacific communities as this very broad and diverse entity are capable of multiple perspectives and opinions. And then I was just thinking around the idea of what we lose in this space, and one thing that came through in my doctoral research which was based on a very different thing altogether, was this idea that Pacific millennials felt really tired and drained and like sick of teaching people and re-sharing their trauma constantly online, and that actually it was these insatiable appetites around brown trauma that got the highest hits, and they felt, you know, journalists were lurking on the Twitter channels kind of preying on this cycle, and that was kind of really interesting to me, because what it meant was that people just left social media, and that yeah, again, it was kind of the same systems and structures that people felt that were outside of that platform had sort of encroached on, or as they gained more profile, their echo chamber changed slightly, and it wasn't able to have that kind of community or therapeutic purpose that it might have once had. And then a separate issue, but I think we also lose facts, and the anti-vax rhetoric is actually really significant in Pacific communities, which we know through the, you know, Samoan measles outbreak, which I think in part impacted their very fast and strict COVID response. Yeah. But I guess one thing that I really wanted to acknowledge is that both me and Rina, I think, speak at first from an anecdotal perspective. And that's because conversations like this feel really rare, where a Pacific or Māori perspective is included in a social media conversation. In my experience, the conversation is usually relegated to the sides of a social anthropology conference or a Pacific Studies conference where we're still trying to advocate, well, you're kind of forced into this weird position where you can't actually have the complex conversations because you're advocating to your own community the value of social media. And so it's really great to be here, but the depth in which we can actually contribute, or I feel that I can contribute, is very limited because the lack of research is so significant. We're not at the policy tables or in the big research institutes that are kind of designing these things. And I feel in some ways Pacific people are just resigned to it being another output of the sort of colonial system at via the university or whatever else we're having to deal with. So those are my quick opening points.
Thanks, Lana, and thanks, Rina. I think you've already given us a lot of really challenging and sort of thought-provoking things to think about, especially this idea that colonization is replicated or is recirculated in social media. I think that's, people might have sort of an abstract sense of that, or maybe no sense of that at all, but I think it's something that really bears further discussion. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more before we open it up to a wider discussion, just this idea of social media and the internet as a, because colonization has much to do with the loss of culture. And how does is social media, are these digital spaces, are they culturalized? Are they decultured spaces? What does that look like from your perspective as Māori and Samoan diasporic individuals?
I think that they're completely cultured, and to go back to what Lana had said before, white, patriarchal, heterosexual, they still carry those underlying aspects of coloniality. So I feel like Lana brought up a really good point. Like, we just kind of pick it up as another tool, much like the education system, which was a Westminster education system or the university, and we use it as best as we can to make as many gains as we can from it. But essentially, it's still a tool of the colonizer or of coloniality. It's still set within these parameters that are not of Indigenous value systems, I suppose. And I mean, even we had spoken a little bit about the opposing kind of forces in terms of the internet as such a connector in such a great way. I mean, I love it. I've watched my 14-year-old nephew grow up literally in Australia, grow up online. But also the idea that this technology comes from the militarization, which we know that the Pacific bears the brunt of the impacts of militarization for the peace of somebody who lives in Central America, for example. And we also know that the development of technology comes at a huge environmental cost. And so as stewards, as guardians, as kaitiaki of the environment, again, this poses another one of those conflicting perspectives that we have to negotiate all the time. But I agree, Indigenous peoples are forever negotiating the environments in which we exist, and online is just an extension of those.
Thank you. Lana, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, the only thing I guess I would want to add is that it's not, in my mind, about a loss of culture necessarily, but it's about a sort of system and structure of power in which the world operates. And so when we talk about white supremacy, when we talk about hate crime or hate speech, all of these things, it's the same thing. When we talk about certain people as the normative people who benefit from universal policies or universal human rights, it's the same thing, where you're actually operating in a system of power where some are empowered and that requires the disempowerment of others. And so to have these conversations, I think it's more about that structural conversation for me rather than the loss of culture, because it's just the same structure.
Yeah. So really directing us to the whole power, the sometimes or oftentimes unseen and sort of unappreciated power dimensions that play out also in social media, not just in terms of access to the hardware, but in terms of how the discourses are generated and then are picked up by outsiders and used or recirculated for other purposes that may be far beyond what was originally intended. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Kia ora. Rina, I think I'm staring at you at the camera, and Lana. Lana, I was just thinking about the point you made before about the difficulty of participating in the conversations being because there's not been a lot of research done, about the impacts around social media for Māori or Pasifika. I'm wondering if either of you have ideas on what that research looks like, what the questions would be. And I ask this question because there could be folks online or at the conference today who could be in a position to help make that research happen. So that's my question.
Do you want to go, Rina?
Yeah, so I think everywhere, all places, all people, everywhere and anywhere. That's basically a Māori development approach. I often have spoken at conferences and I encourage a lot of people to do research. It doesn't matter what it is, but in this space, because there is none. Well, actually I lie, there's in total, the last time I checked, 12 pieces of research undertaken by Māori about online spaces. So it's kind of about everywhere and everywhere, and whatever you can do is going to contribute to the conversation. We just have not considered at any great length or had the opportunity to have any in-depth conversations around what the space looks like and where this is leading us to. And if I think back to when I first proposed the idea of my PhD, I was being led to investigate specifically tangihanga, for example. So the funeral spaces which have gone online, especially during COVID, we saw a great number of tangi being broadcast online, and how whānau and families navigated the cultural responsibility, the tikanga and the kawa that were based around that sacred ritual. So I had been in the initial stages asked to maybe just focus on that. And to be honest, I said to my supervisors, I don't think I have the heart, and I don't think I have the stamina to undertake research in that specific space around digital use. And so I kind of took a step back and saw that there's actually no foundational information. So that's kind of where I've been, just about putting forward some conversations by which people might take up these areas of inquiry, because there's just nothing. Just you can pick anything and literally become the expert in it, because there's nobody out there doing it. So I encourage everybody, anywhere and everywhere, that's kind of just try and all the spaces. I don't know if that's very helpful, but that is definitely what one of our Mason jury is a big advocate of, kind of everywhere and anywhere.
Rina, you've talked about having sort of a framework for this, for Māori engagement online. Can you say a bit more about that, what that looks like? Because that sounds to me like you were talking about establishing sort of a foundation or a basis, and that seems to be an important part of that.
Yeah, so I think from a Māori perspective, looking at whakapapa, so looking at history, the evolution of things, so that we can critically analyze what's going on and what's happened in the past and what is it that we learn from the past in order to go forward. And then we've got like several frameworks that have been developed over time. So for example, Te Whare Tapawha, which is Mason Jury's framework for health, but is now being applied in education and in all these other areas. And then we've got our Māori development goals, we've got outcomes for Māori education. So we've got a whole lot of frameworks and goals that have been developed. So I've just been in the process of kind of laying out all of these things and looking at what offers some guidance perhaps for Māori engagement in these spaces. But I mean, look, anybody out there wanting to do something in that area as well, go, do it, everywhere and anywhere, people.